in noch niemals dagewesenen Millionen Demonstrationen hat sich am heutigen Tage die ganze deutsche Nation zur Arbeit, zu ihrem Wert, zu ihrem sittlichen Ethos und zu ihrer nationalen Verbundenheit bekannt.
That was the notorious Dr. Josef Goebbels. His inflammatory speeches concerning the Polish city of Danzig provided the spark which lit the flames of the Second World War. Goebbels was born in Reit, an industrial town south of Mönchengladbach on the edge of the Ruhr district. And Goebbels was marked out by a deformed right leg, the result of osteomyelitis and a failed operation to correct it. Throughout his life, Goebbels wore a metal brace and a special shoe because of his shortened leg, but nevertheless he walked with a limp. In August 1914, the Great War flared into Josef Goebbels' life, and he was desperate to join up and fight, but his disability debarred him from ever serving in the Great War.
Goebbels was rejected for military service in World War I, and that was something that he bitterly resented. He did, however, serve as what's called an office soldier from June to October 1917 in the Patriotic Help Unit in his hometown of Reit. So he did manage to get into a uniform of some description. Being refused for the army was to prove a lasting disappointment and frustration for Goebbels. He was to spend the rest of his working life surrounded by men who were veterans, who enjoyed the Kameradschaft, the fellowship of the Great War veterans. Goebbels wasn't a part of that, and sometimes he tried to pretend he was, and he misrepresented himself as a war veteran who was the victim of a war wound, and he tried to explain his disability that way, which is rather pathetic, I think.
From the moment he joined the fledgling Nazi Party, the DAP as it was then known, Adolf Hitler took charge of the propaganda function. And as a result of his experience in the Great War, Hitler correctly assessed that the most important activity for a political party was the control and influence of the mass media. The terrible crimes of the Nazi regime were so monstrous that they now overshadow the fact that Hitler was first and foremost a formidable politician. His fearsome oratorical skills made him a communicator par excellence, and his self-study program in art and design contributed to Hitler's powerful record as a master of political presentation.
Denn als unsere Partei gerade 7 Mann hoch war, sprach sie schon 2 Grundsätze aus. Erstens, sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland. Wir mussten als Partei in der Minorität bleiben, weil wir die wertvollsten Elemente des Kampfes und des Opfersinns in der Nation mobilisierten, die zu allen Zeiten nicht die Mehrheit, sondern die Minderheit ausgemacht haben.
Hitler quickly formed a highly credible and practical understanding of the mechanics of mass communication. And he instinctively understood how eye-catching graphic design, mass rallies and symbolism could effectively be harnessed to shape public opinion. The infamous swastika design, the Hakenkreuz, on the red and black flag was Hitler's personal creation. And the menacing Third Reich eagle was also shaped by Hitler. He was also the mind behind the mass rallies, which were so important in his rise to power. And it's an uncomfortable truth, but many of the tactics practiced by today's politicians at mass rallies, which we're now so familiar with, were developed and road tested by Adolf Hitler.
Hitler undoubtedly had an innate genius for propaganda. However, as the popularity of the party mushroomed, Hitler could no longer dedicate his time to the propaganda function. And in April 1930, he was finally forced to delegate the responsibility for propaganda to one of his lieutenants.
The man chosen as the new head of propaganda was Josef Goebbels, a former journalist who at the time was a Nazi party Gauleiter based in Berlin. Goebbels soon proved his skills. He was to prove incredibly loyal to Hitler, on whose behalf he preached a creed of intolerance, violence and radical hatred which struck a chord with Nazi supporters. He also mobilised the infamous SA, the Nazi brown shirts, and goaded them into action, such as the notorious Kristallnacht.
After the Great War, Goebbels studied literature and philosophy at the universities of Bonn, Würzburg, Freiburg and Heidelberg, and his keen intelligence and political astuteness were generally acknowledged even by his enemies. Goebbels worked as a journalist, and he tried for several years to become a published author. And Goebbels was always embittered by his failure to build a literary career.
Goebbels joined the party in late 1924, at a time when Hitler was in prison. The party was then being run by Gregor Strasser, who became the principal Nazi organiser in northern Germany. Like Strasser, Goebbels and other leading figures in the north took the socialist agenda of what was after all the National Socialist Workers' Party far more seriously than did Hitler and other members of the Bavarian leadership of the party who were all based in the south.
It's ironic, given what he later became, but Goebbels was initially horrified by Hitler's characterization of socialism as a Jewish creation. Hitler's declaration that the Soviet Union must be destroyed also clashed with Goebbels' strong socialist convictions. And during the 20s, there certainly was a schism in the party, which saw Hitler and the southern-based faction as being focused on anti-Semitic and, above all, ultra-nationalist policies, who were on the one side, while Strasser, Goebbels and the northern Nazis were focused on what they considered to be a true socialist agenda. So there was a real schism in the party.
Hitler's public assertion that private property would not be expropriated by the Nazi government was the final straw for the northern socialist parties. Goebbels was outraged, saying, "I no longer fully believe in Hitler, and that's the terrible thing. My inner support has been taken away." And Goebbels had realized that in Hitler's opinion, the real enemy of the German people was always going to be the Jews, not the capitalists, and Goebbels was bitterly disillusioned. "I feel devastated," wrote Goebbels. "What sort of Hitler is this? A mere reactionary?"
However, in February 1926, Hitler, having finished working on Mein Kampf, made a sudden return to party affairs, and he soon disabused the Northerners of any illusions about where he stood. Hitler was a formidable political operator, and he summoned about 60 Gauleiters and other activists, including Goebbels, to a meeting in Bamberg, in Streicher's Gau of Franconia. And here he gave a 2-hour speech in which he repudiated the political programme of the socialist wing of the party. And it was here that Goebbels fell under Hitler's spell.
Despite the differences between them, Hitler recognized Goebbels' talents, and in April 1926 he brought Goebbels to Munich, sending his own car to meet him at the railway station, and gave him a long private audience. Hitler berated Goebbels over his support for the socialist line, but offered to wipe the slate clean if Goebbels would now accept his leadership. Goebbels capitulated completely, offering Hitler his total loyalty, a pledge that was clearly sincere and that he adhered to until the end of his life. And from this point onwards, Goebbels devoted himself to the person of the Führer. His enduring loyalty was summed up by his own phrase: "He who forsakes the Führer withers away." In October 1926, the Nazi Party was still a long way from power, and Hitler needed shrewd political operators and rewarded Goebbels for his newfound loyalty by making him the party Gauleiter for the Berlin section of the Nazi Party. Hitler still perceived Berlin to be a stronghold of the socialists and communists, and Goebbels was eager to prove that this was no longer the case.
Through the actions of the SA, the street fighters under his command, Goebbels was determined to openly challenge the dominant parties of the left. These were the Social Democrats and the Communists. And working with the local SA leaders, he deliberately provoked beer hall battles and street brawls. And in the process, he turned the street fighter, a man called Horst Wessel, who was actually killed at his home by his adversaries, into a genuine martyr and a hero. The song written in his honour became the official anthem of the Nazi Party, and both Goebbels and Hitler attended a very solemn public funeral for Horst Wessel.
As the undisputed face of the Nazi Party in Berlin, Goebbels was secure, and he was able to give full expression to his genius for propaganda. As editor of the Berlin newspaper Der Angriff, the attack, and as the author of a steady stream of Nazi posters and handbills, he rose within a few months to be the city's most feared agitator. His propaganda techniques were totally cynical. "That propaganda is good which leads to success, and that is bad which fails to achieve the desired result," he wrote. "It is not propaganda's task to be intelligent, its task is to lead to success."
Behaupten, das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
Among his favourite targets were socialist leaders such as Hermann Müller and Karl Severin, and above all the Jewish Berlin police president Bernhard Weiss, whom he subjected to a relentless campaign of Jew baiting in the hope of provoking a crackdown he could then exploit politically. The Social Democrat city government duly obliged in 1927 with an 8-month ban on the party, which Goebbels exploited to the limit.
Goebbels also discovered a talent for oratory and was soon second in the Nazi movement only to Hitler as a public speaker. Now, where Hitler's style was hoarse and passionate, Goebbels was cool, sarcastic, and often humorous. He was a master of biting invective and insinuation, although he could whip himself in a rhetorical frenzy if the occasion demanded. Unlike Hitler, however, he retained a cynical detachment from his own rhetoric.
Frage euch, seid ihr entschlossen, dem Führer in der Erkämpfung des Sieges durch dick und dünn und der schwersten persönlichen Belastungen zu folgen? Unseren Feinden das zugerufen, was sie wissen müssen, damit sie sich keine Illusionen und falschen Vorstellungen hingeben. Der mächtigste Bundesgenosse, den es auf dieser Welt gibt, das Volk selbst, steht hinter uns und ist entschlossen, mit dem Führer, koste es, was es wolle, und unter Aufnahme auch der schwersten Opfer, den Siegkämpfe zu erstreiten. Von jetzt ab die Parole, nun Volk, steh auf und Sturm bricht los!
Goebbels openly acknowledged that he was exploiting the lowest instincts of the German people: racism, xenophobia, class envy, insecurity. He claimed that he could play the popular will like a piano, and he was adept at leading the masses wherever he wanted them to go. And he certainly could drive many of his listeners into a kind of ecstasy. He made them stand up, sing songs, raise their arms, repeat oaths. And he did it not through some kind of passionate inspiration of the moment, but as the result of a sober psychological calculation. And that is the essence of Goebbels.
Despite his political prowess, Goebbels' words and actions made little impact on the political loyalties of Berlin. At the 1928 Reichstag elections, the Nazis polled less than 2% of the vote in Berlin, compared with 33% for the Social Democrats and 25% for the Communists. However, this election was to prove to be crucial, as Goebbels was only one of 10 Nazis elected to the Reichstag, a position which brought him a salary of 750 Reichsmarks a month and immunity from prosecution.
Even when the Great Depression led an enormous surge in support for the Nazis across Germany, Berlin resisted the party's appeal more than any other part of Germany. At its peak in 1932, the Nazi Party polled just 28% of the vote in Berlin. Goebbels nonetheless stood high in Hitler's regard. By 1933, still aged only 35, he was acknowledged to be one of the inner circle of Nazi leaders.
In April 1930, Hitler fired Strasser as head of the Nazi Party national propaganda apparatus and appointed Goebbels to replace him, giving him control of the party's national newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, People's Observer, as well as other Nazi papers across the country. Goebbels' most important contribution to the Nazi cause between 1930 and 1933 was the organization of successive election campaigns. He proved to be a political genius, choreographing Hitler's dramatic airplane tours of Germany and pioneering the use of radio and cinema for electoral campaigning. Goebbels, as party campaign manager, was naturally given much of the credit. The Nazi Party's use of torchlight parades, brass bands, massed choirs and similar techniques caught the imagination of many voters, particularly the young.
When Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933, Goebbels was initially given no office whatsoever. The coalition cabinet, which Hitler headed, contained only a minority of Nazis, and that was part of the deal that Hitler had negotiated with President Paul von Hindenburg and the conservative parties that he led. However, as the propaganda head of the ruling party, a party with no great respect for the law, Goebbels behaved as though he was in power. He commandeered the state radio to produce a live broadcast of the torchlight parade that celebrated Hitler's assumption to office. But he didn't have too long to wait, because on the 13th of March 1933, Goebbels had his reward for his part in bringing the Nazis to power, and he was appointed Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, and with it came a seat in the cabinet.
The role of the new ministry was to centralize Nazi control of all aspects of German culture and intellectual life, particularly the press, radio and the visual and performing arts. On the 10th of May, he supervised the burning of 20,000 books by Jewish or anti-Nazi authors.
Alter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Übergebt alles Undeutsche dem Feuer gegen Klassenkampf und Materialismus. Ich übergebe dem Feuer die Schriften von Karl Marx und Kautsky. Ich übergebe dem Feuer die Schriften von Heinrich Mann, Ernst Gläser, Erich Kästner. Ich übergebe dem Feuer die Schriften der Schule Sigmund Freud. Ich übergebe dem Feuer die Schriften des Erich Maria Remarque. Ich übergebe dem Feuer die Schriften von Alfred Herr. Gegen Frechheit und Anmaßung, für Achtung und Ehrfurcht vor dem unsterblichen deutschen Volksgeist. Verschlinge Flamme auf die Schriften der Tucholsky und Ossietzky.
Goebbels soon established separate Reichskammer, Reich chambers, to oversee press, radio, film, theatre, music, literature and publishing, and their business was to supervise the purge of Jews, socialists and liberals, as well as practitioners of degenerate art forms such as abstract art.
Soon the content of every newspaper, book, novel, play, film, broadcast and concert was subject to supervision by the propaganda ministry. In Nazi Germany, no author could publish, no painter could exhibit, no singer could broadcast, no critic could criticise, unless they were a member of the appropriate Reich Chamber, and membership was conditional on good behaviour. Goebbels was sensitive to charges that he was dragging German culture down to the level of mere propaganda. He responded by saying that the purpose of both art and propaganda was to bring about a spiritual mobilization of the German people.
Despite the enormous power of the propaganda ministry over the German cultural life, Goebbels' status began to decline once the Nazi regime was firmly established in power. Once the political enemies of the Nazi party were destroyed, Goebbels' propaganda efforts began to lose their point, and without an organised enemy to fight, his rhetoric began to sound hollow and unconvincing.
As a well-educated and even a cultured man, Goebbels had once mocked the primitive anti-Semitism of Nazis such as Julius Streicher. But Goebbels needed a political cause, and he shamelessly adopted extreme anti-Semitism with all the cynical zeal of an ambitious politician on the make. And Goebbels took every opportunity to attack the Jews, and from 1933 onwards, he was bracketed with Streicher among the regime's most virulent anti-Semites.
Goebbels maintained constant pressure on the city's large Jewish community, forcing them out of business and professional life, and placing obstacles in the way of their being able to live normal lives, such as banning them from public transport and city facilities. There was some respite during 1936, whilst Berlin hosted the Olympic Games, but from 1937 the intensity of his anti-Semitic words and actions began to increase again.
In 1937, Goebbels began an intense affair with a Czech actress, Lida Barova. But Magda complained to Hitler, who was an arch-conservative in sexual matters, who was also fond of Magda and the Goebbels' young children. He ordered Goebbels to break off his affair. Goebbels offered his resignation, which Hitler refused. On the 15th of October 1937, Goebbels attempted suicide. A furious Hitler then ordered Himmler to remove Barova from Germany, and she was deported to Czechoslovakia. These events embarrassed Hitler and the party and severely damaged Goebbels' standing with Hitler. And his zeal in furthering Hitler's anti-Semitic agenda was, in part, an effort to restore his reputation. The Barova affair, however, did nothing to dampen Goebbels' enthusiasm for womanizing.
Early in 1938, Goebbels organised a massive nationwide pogrom against the Jews. The result of Goebbels' efforts was Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, during which the SR and Nazi Party went on a rampage of anti-Jewish violence and destruction, killing at least 90 and maybe as many as 200 people, destroying over 1,000 synagogues and hundreds of Jewish businesses and homes, and dragging some 30,000 Jews off to concentration camps, where at least another 1,000 died before the remainder were released, after several months of brutal treatment.
It's interesting to note that the longer-term effect was actually self-defeating. It did drive 80,000 Jews to emigrate, and most left behind their property in their desperation to escape. However, foreign opinion reacted with understandable horror to what was going on, and that had the effect of bringing to a sudden end the climate of appeasement of Nazi Germany, certainly among the Western democracies. Goebbels' pogrom moved Germany significantly closer to war, at a time when rearmament was still far from complete. Goering and some of the other Nazi leaders were furious at Goebbels' actions, and they had not been consulted.
Despite the loss of real power suffered by Goebbels during the middle years of the Nazi regime, he remained one of Hitler's intimates. Goebbels was a frequent visitor to the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden, and Goebbels was a good listener. And during his many visits, he became adept at listening to Hitler's monologues and agreeing with his opinions, although he was not kept officially informed of military and diplomatic movements. Goebbels could rely upon these informal meetings to keep abreast of Hitler's thinking. As a result of his continuing closeness to Hitler and his constant presence at the Berghof in the months leading up to the war, Goebbels' influence began to increase again. He now ranked along with von Ribbentrop, Goering, Himmler and Martin Bormann as the senior Nazi with the most access to Hitler, which in an autocratic regime meant access to power. The fact that Hitler was so fond of Magda Goebbels and the children also gave Goebbels entree to Hitler's inner circle.
In the years 1936 to 1939, Hitler, while professing his desire for peace, led Germany firmly and deliberately towards a confrontation. Goebbels was one of the most enthusiastic proponents of aggressively pursuing Germany's territorial ambitions, and he was well aware that the great majority of Germans didn't actually want a war, and he used every propaganda resource at his disposal to overcome what he called the war psychosis. And he tried to do that by whipping up sympathy for the Sudeten Germans and also hatred of the Czechs. After the Western powers had acceded to Hitler's demands concerning Czechoslovakia in 1938, Goebbels soon redirected his propaganda machine against Poland. And from May onwards, he actually orchestrated a hate campaign against Poland that was to lead directly to World War II.
Once war began in September 1939, Hitler, as supreme commander, was wholly focused on military affairs. Initially, the news was good, and the Blitzkrieg swept through Europe. After the euphoric scenes of 1940, Hitler made few public appearances, and even his broadcasts became less frequent. So Goebbels increasingly became the face and the voice of the Nazi regime for the German people. From 1940 onwards, Goebbels began a steady process of extending his influence over domestic policy. With Hitler preoccupied with the war, Himmler focusing on the final solution of the Jewish question in Eastern Europe, and with Hermann Goering's position declining with the failure of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, Goebbels sensed a power vacuum in domestic policy and moved to fill it. Since civilian morale was his responsibility, he increasingly concerned himself with matters such as wages, rationing and housing, which affected morale and therefore productivity. Goebbels, nonetheless, continued to contribute to the persecution of the Jews. The decision to deport the German and Austrian Jews to unspecified destinations in the East was made in September 1941, and Goebbels immediately pressed for the Berlin Jews to be deported first. To lobby for his demands, Goebbels travelled to Hitler's headquarters at the Eastern Front for a meeting with Hitler and Reinhard Heydrich. He got the assurances he wanted. The first cities to be made Jew-free were to be Berlin, Vienna and Prague. Berlin was to be first in the queue. As a result of Goebbels' efforts, deportations of Berlin Jews to the Lodz ghetto began in October, but transport and other difficulties made the process much slower than Goebbels desired. His November article in Das Reich was part of his campaign to have the pace of deportation accelerated.
In December 1941, Goebbels was present when Hitler addressed a meeting of Gauleiters and other senior Nazis, and they discussed, among other things, what they called the Jewish question. Goebbels wrote in his diary afterwards that with regard to the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to make a clean sweep of it. And although the propaganda ministry was not invited to the Wannsee conference, Goebbels knew what had been decided, certainly by March 1942. And because of that, he wrote in his diary, "The Jews are now being deported to the East," which he described as a fairly barbaric procedure and not to be described in any greater detail. 60% of the Jews, he acknowledged, would be liquidated, while the remainder would be worked to death.
During 1942, Goebbels continued to press for the final solution to the Jewish question to be carried forward as quickly as possible, especially now that Germany had occupied a huge swathe of Soviet territory into which all the Jews of German-controlled Europe could be deported. The plan was that they could be worked to death in accordance with the plan agreed on at the Wannsee Conference, convened by Heydrich in January 1942. It was a constant annoyance to Goebbels that at a time when Germany was fighting for its life on the Eastern Front, there were still 40,000 Jews in Berlin.
Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestoppt werden.
He wrote in his diary, they should be carted off to Russia. It would be best to kill them altogether. However, in February 1943, the crushing German defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad produced a crisis in the regime which overshadowed the anti-Semitic policies.
During 1943 and 1944, the Soviet armies advanced towards the borders of the Reich, and the Western Allies developed the ability to launch devastating air raids on most German cities, including Berlin. At the same time, there were increasingly critical shortages of food, raw materials, fuel and housing. At this juncture, Goebbels himself became public voice of the Nazi regime, both in his regular broadcasts and his weekly editorials in Das Reich. In public, Goebbels remained confident of German victory. In private, he was discouraged by the unremitting pattern of military failure. But throughout everything, Goebbels remained preoccupied with the annihilation of the Jews, which was now reaching its climax in the extermination camps of eastern Poland.
As Germany's military and economic situation grew steadily worse, Goebbels assumed the title Reich Plenipotentiary for total war. The trio of Goebbels, Himmler and Speer now became the real centre of German government. Elements of the army leadership tried to assassinate Hitler in the July 20th plot. It was this triumvirate which rallied resistance to the plotters. In July 1944, Goebbels promised Hitler that he could raise 1 million new soldiers by means of a reorganization of the army, transferring personnel from the Navy and the Luftwaffe, and purging the bloated Reich ministries. However, it was too late for Goebbels to make any real difference to the outcome of the war. The combined economic and military power of the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, now fully mobilized, was simply too great for Germany to overcome.
In the last months of the war, Goebbels' speeches and articles took on an increasingly apocalyptic tone. This was in real life for him, Götterdämmerung being played out. Here was the twilight of the gods. By the beginning of 1945, with the Soviets on the Oder and the Western Allies preparing to cross the Rhine, Goebbels could no longer disguise the fact that defeat was inevitable. And he certainly knew what fate he would face. So when other Nazi leaders talked about moving to Bavaria in order to establish a centre for resistance there, he was arguing for a last stand in the ruins of the Reich capital.
By February 1945, Goebbels was ever present at the side of Hitler. By this stage of the war, Goering was utterly discredited, and even Himmler was in disgrace since his appointment as commander of Army Group Vistula had led to disaster on the Oder. Only Goebbels and Bormann remained in favour and totally loyal to Hitler. Unlike many other leading Nazis at this juncture, Goebbels proved to have strong convictions, moving himself and his family into the Vorbunker. He told Vice Admiral Hans-Erich Voss that he would not entertain the idea of either surrender or escape.
Shortly after midnight on the 29th of April 1945, with the Soviets advancing ever closer to the bunker complex, Hitler dictated his last will and testament. Goebbels was one of 4 witnesses. In the mid-afternoon of the 30th of April, Hitler shot himself. Of Hitler's death, Goebbels commented, "The heart of Germany has ceased to beat, The Führer is dead.
When Goebbels learned that Hitler had committed suicide, he was very depressed and said, "It is a great pity that such a man is not with us any longer, but there is nothing to be done. For us, everything is lost now, and the only way left for us is the one which Hitler chose. I shall follow his example." Goebbels and his wife took the lives of their 6 children before killing themselves.